For over 3,000 years, every species that joined the Galactic Confederacy received the same briefing. It did not matter if they were warriors or merchants or scientists. It did not matter if they came from gas giants or frozen moons or burning desert worlds. The message was always the same, and it was always delivered with the same grave. Seriousness never provoked the humans. The warning was embedded in first contact protocols. It was written into trade agreements and peace treaties. It was whispered among spacefaring cultures like an ancient proverb that no one dared to question. Young officers heard it on their first day of training. Old admirals repeated it before they retired. The words had become part of the galaxy itself, as constant as the spinning of stars. Ambassador Kira Voss of Earth understood this better than most. She stood before the Confederacy Council in the great chamber on Station Zenith, her silver hair catching the light of 3 distant suns through the massive viewport behind her. At 73 years old, she had spent 4 decades in diplomatic service. She had negotiated with species that breathed methane and species that communicated through patterns of light. She had prevented wars and ended conflicts and built bridges between civilizations that had nothing in common, except their desire to survive. In all that time, humanity had kept its promise of peace. They explored. They traded. They shared their art and their music and their strange, stubborn optimism with anyone who would listen. They asked questions about everything and answered questions about anything. They were curious and loud and sometimes annoying, but they were not dangerous. At least, that was what the younger species believed. The Confederacy had cataloged over 900 sentient species across the known galaxy. Some were ancient beyond measure, their civilizations stretching back millions of years. Some were newcomers, still learning how to build ships that could carry them between stars. But none of them were quite like the humans. Humans were not the strongest species. The Kroner could lift 10 times their own weight and survive in the vacuum of space without protection. Humans were not the fastest. The Sylvani could process information so quickly that conversations with other species felt like talking to statues. Humans were not the longest lived. The Velnorians existed for millennia, watching empires rise and fall like waves on a cosmic shore, yet something about humans unsettled the galaxy. Something in the way they looked at the universe as if it belonged to them, and they simply had not claimed it yet. Something in the way they refused to accept limits, as if the word impossible was just a challenge waiting to be overcome. Other species evolved to fit their environments. Humans changed their environments to fit themselves. It was a small difference, but it meant everything. High Chancellor Morvax of the Zenthari Dominion understood this fear. His species had learned it the hard way 2,000 years ago. In a lesson that still echoed through their history like a wound that would not heal, he sat in his private chambers aboard the station, reviewing the ancient records on a screen that flickered with age. The files were classified at the highest level, sealed by order of every Zenthari leader since the incident. But Morvax had read them 100 times. He could recite them from memory. He returned to them whenever he needed to remind himself why the warning existed. 2,000 years ago, a small human colony vessel had drifted into Zenthari space. The ship was crippled, its hull torn open by a meteor strike that had killed half the crew. The survivors were dying slowly, their life support systems failing one by one. They sent distress calls in every language they knew, begging for help from anyone who could hear them. The Zenthari heard them. They tracked the vessel. They analyzed its systems and its crew and its desperate pleas for mercy. They watched the humans struggle to survive, watched them ration their air and their water and their hope, and then they did nothing. The Zenthari? High Command had decided that helping the humans would show weakness. It would invite more of them into Zenthari space, and who knew what trouble that might bring. Better to let nature take its course. Better to let the humans die quietly in the cold darkness between stars, forgotten by everyone except the void itself. 3 years later, humanity returned. They did not come with diplomacy. They did not come with pleas or negotiations or offers of peace. They came with a fleet that burned so bright the Zenthari thought their sun had gone supernova. Ships by the hundreds, armed with weapons that should not have existed, piloted by crews who fought as if they had nothing left to lose. The war lasted 6 months. The Zenthari surrendered unconditionally. Their mighty empire, which had stood for 10,000 years, bent its knee to a species that had only been traveling between stars for 3 centuries. After the surrender, the human admiral had met with the Xanthari leaders. He was a young man by their standards, barely 50 years old, with tired eyes and a quiet voice. He did not gloat. He did not threaten. He did not make demands beyond what was reasonable. He simply told them the truth. Those colonists on that broken ship had sent one final message before they died. They had used the last of their power to broadcast a recording to Earth. It showed their faces. It showed their children. It showed them holding each other as the air ran out and the cold crept in. And then it showed them forgiving the Xanthari. The Admiral had played that recording for the Xanthari leaders. He let them watch as the dying humans spoke of hope and mercy and the belief that someday, somehow, the galaxy would become a better place. He let them hear the children singing songs about Earth, about blue skies and green fields they would never see again. He let them see the parents comforting their little ones, telling them stories about a home that existed only in memory. Then he told them why humanity had come. Not for revenge. Not for conquest. Not for territory or resources or power. Humanity had come because those colonists deserved to be remembered. They deserved to have their deaths mean something. They deserved to know that their people would never forget them, that their sacrifice would echo through history forever. That was the day the warning began. Admiral Daniel Parker of Earth's 7th. Fleet thought about this history as he sat in his command chair aboard the flagship Endeavour. It was 3 a.m. by ship time, and the bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of engines and the gentle beeping of sensors. Most of the crew was asleep, trusting the night watch to keep them safe. Daniel was not asleep. He was staring at a transmission that had arrived 20 minutes ago, reading the words over and over as if they might change if he looked at them long enough. They did not change. A human agricultural colony on the edge of known space had gone silent. 40,000 civilians lived there, families, children, scientists and farmers and teachers and dreamers. The colony was called New Haven. It had been founded 30 years ago by people who wanted to grow food for a dozen hungry systems. They had asked for nothing except the chance to help others. Now they were silent. No distress calls. No emergency beacons. Just silence, cold and complete. Daniel looked at his executive officer, Commander Katie Sullivan, who had come to the bridge the moment she heard the news. Her face was pale, her hands steady, despite the fear in her eyes. She was 35 years old and had served with Daniel for a decade. She knew him well enough to read the look in his eyes. "Get me everything on the Dracorian Empire," he said quietly. Katie's expression did not change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or recognition of what was about to begin. "Sir, the Dracorians have never violated Confederacy law before." Daniel nodded slowly. He looked back at the transmission, at the silence where 40,000 voices should have been. Somewhere out there, in the darkness between stars, something terrible had happened. And someone was going to answer for it. There was a first time for everything. The colony world of New Haven had been beautiful once. Rolling fields of engineered wheat stretched to the horizon in every direction, golden and bright under the light of a young sun. The settlement's founder, Dr. Nathan Cole, had spent his entire career developing crops that could thrive in alien soil. He had dreamed of feeding billions, of ending hunger across a dozen star systems, of proving that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy was not weapons or technology, but simple kindness. Now the fields were. Ash. Lieutenant Commander Sam Griffin led the reconnaissance team through the ruins of what had once been the colony's main settlement. His squad moved in practiced silence, their boots crunching on scorched earth that still radiated heat. The air smelled of smoke and something worse, something that Sam did not want to think about. He had seen battlefields before. He had walked through the aftermath of wars and disasters and accidents, but this was different. This was not a battle. This was an execution. The destruction was systematic and methodical. Buildings had been reduced to rubble in precise patterns. as if someone had taken the time to ensure that nothing remained standing. Power stations had been targeted first, then communication arrays, then water treatment facilities. Whoever had done this had wanted to make sure that no one could call for help, that no one could survive, that no one could escape. "Over here," called Sergeant Megan Price, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Sam walked over to where she stood at the edge of what had once been the colony's central plaza. The ground was covered in debris and ash, but one structure remained partially intact. It was a wall, perhaps 10 feet tall, made of local stone that had somehow survived the fires. The colonists had carved names into that wall before the end. Sam counted them as he approached, his heart growing heavier with each number. 100, 500, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. The names covered every inch of the stone, carved with desperate hands in the final hours before death arrived. Some were neat and careful. Others were rough and hurried. Near the bottom, where small hands could reach, the names were written in childish letters. 42,000 names. Men and women and children. Entire families recorded on a wall of stone because there was nothing else. They could do. Sam removed his helmet and knelt in the dirt. He had served 20 years in the fleet. He had seen combat and loss and the cold mathematics of interstellar war. He had made peace with the fact that sometimes good people died for no reason at all. But this was something else entirely. This was murder dressed in the language of conquest. "Sir," said Corporal Danny Wells, approaching from behind. "We found survivors." Sam's head snapped up. "Survivors. How many?" 3. They were hiding in an underground storage facility. 2 adults and a child. Sam followed Danny through the ruins to a collapsed building on the edge of the settlement. A hole had been cleared in the rubble, revealing a staircase that led down into darkness. At the bottom, huddled together in a space barely large enough for them to stand, were the survivors. The first was an old man with white hair and trembling hands. His name was George Palmer, and he had been a teacher at the colony school. The second was a young woman named Lisa Turner, a botanist who had come to New Haven to study Dr. Cole's crops. The third was a boy, no more than 7 years old, who had not spoken a word since they found him. "It came at night," George whispered, his eyes staring at nothing. "The Dracorians? We did not even know they were in orbit until the bomb started falling. There was no warning, no demands, no communication at all. They just started killing." Sam knelt beside the old man. "Why? Why would they attack an agricultural colony?" George shook his head. "I do not know. We had no weapons. We had no military value. We were farmers and scientists and teachers. We grew food. That was all we did," Lisa spoke up, her voice hollow. "They landed ground troops after the bombardment. They went through the settlement building by building, making sure no one was left alive. We only survived because George knew about this storage facility. We hid here for 3 days, listening to them search." The boy said nothing. He just stared at the wall, his small hands clutching a stuffed animal that was missing one arm. Sam stood up and walked away from the survivors, far enough that they could not hear him. He activated his communication device and connected to the Endeavor. "Admiral Parker, this is Lieutenant Commander Griffin. I am transmitting my report now." Back on the flagship, Daniel Parker received the report. His hands did not shake. His voice did not waver. He sat in his command chair and read every word, looked at every image, absorbed every detail of what had happened to New Haven. His bridge crew stood around him in absolute silence. Watching their commander process the horror that had been delivered to his screen, Katie Sullivan stood at his side, her face as pale as marble. "Sir, the Dracorian High Command has issued a statement." "Read it." Katie took a breath. "They claim New Haven was harboring terrorists who threatened Dracorian security. They say the attack was a surgical strike against a military target. They express regret for any civilian casualties, but maintain that their actions were justified under Confederacy law." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the names carved into that stone wall. He thought about the children who had written their own names because their parents were too busy trying to save them. He thought about a 7-year-old boy who had not spoken in 3 days because he had seen things no child should ever see. Surgical strike, he repeated softly. They killed children and called it surgical. He activated the fleet-wide communication channel. His face appeared on every screen across 17 warships, broadcast to every officer and crew member in the 7th Fleet. They saw their admiral, the man they had followed for years, the man they trusted with their lives. They saw the look in his eyes. This is Admiral Parker. By now, you have all seen the reconnaissance footage from New Haven. You have read the names of the dead. 42,000 of our people were murdered in their beds by a species that believed we would not respond. The Dracorian Empire thinks they can commit this atrocity without consequence. They think humanity has grown soft during the long peace. They think we have forgotten who we are. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the fleet. They were warned. Every species in this galaxy was warned. Do not provoke humanity. Do not harm our people. Do not mistake our kindness for weakness. The Dracorians ignored that warning. They thought it was a story, a legend, a myth from ancient times. They are about to learn that it is not a myth. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes burning with quiet fury. We are going to New Haven first. We are going to recover our dead. We are going to bring home those 3 survivors. And then we are going to remind the galaxy why that warning exists. The channel closed. The bridge was silent. Katie looked at her admiral, at the man she had served for 10 years. Sir, the Dracorians have 2,000 warships. We have 17. Daniel nodded. Then we will need to be creative. The Galactic Confederacy Council erupted into chaos the moment the news arrived. Species that had not spoken to each other in centuries suddenly found common cause in a single, desperate goal. Representatives who had spent their careers arguing over trade routes and territorial boundaries forgot their differences entirely. Nothing else mattered now except preventing what was about to happen. High Chancellor Morvac stood at the center of the great chamber, his forearms raised in a futile attempt to restore order. Voices shouted over each other in a dozen languages. Translators struggled to keep up with the flood of words. Fear filled the room like smoke, thick and choking. We must intervene, Morvax declared, his voice amplified to cut through the noise. We must broker a peace before this escalates beyond our control. The chamber fell silent. Every eye, every sensor, every attention-gathering organ turned toward the human delegation on the far side of the room. Ambassador. Kira Voss stood slowly. At 73 years old, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had long ago learned that patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. She walked to the center of the floor, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet, and faced the High Chancellor directly. Chancellor Morvax, she began, her voice calm and measured with respect. The time for intervention was before the Dracorians burned 42,000 innocent people alive. You had intelligence. Your listening posts detected their fleet movements 3 days before the attack. Your analysts predicted something was wrong. You chose not to act, Morvax stiffened. The Confederacy does not interfere in regional disputes. It is not our place to police every corner of the galaxy. Regional dispute? Kira let the words hang in the air. Is that what you are calling the murder of children? A regional dispute? Ambassador Voss, I understand your anger. I share your grief, but you must see reason. The Dracorian Empire controls 47 star systems. They have a fleet of 2,000 warships. If humanity attacks them, it will mean war on a scale this galaxy has not seen in a millennium. We did not start this war, Chancellor, but we will finish it. The Velnorian delegate spoke for the first time in 300 years. The Velnorians were beings of crystalline light, ancient beyond measure, who had witnessed the rise and fall of 100 civilizations. They rarely involved themselves in the affairs of younger species. When they spoke, the galaxy listened. We have seen this before, the Velnorian said, its voice like wind chimes in a storm. When humanity is wounded, they do not retreat. They do not negotiate. They do not count the odds or weigh the costs. They remember, and then they act. This is not a threat, Chancellor Morvax. It is a prediction. The chamber erupted again, but this time the voices were different. There was no anger in them now. Only fear on Earth. President Ryan Marshall addressed the United Human Coalition from the steps of the Global Assembly Building. His face was weathered by years of service, his eyes tired from sleepless nights. He had campaigned on a platform of expanded exploration and scientific cooperation. He had promised voters that humanity's future lay in discovery, not destruction. He had never wanted to be a wartime leader, but the universe did not care what he wanted. "I have authorized Admiral Parker to proceed with Operation Reckoning," he announced. His voice broadcast to every human settlement across 100 worlds. "We did not seek this conflict. We did not provoke it. We spent 3,000 years proving to the galaxy that we could be trusted, that we were builders and dreamers and explorers. We ask only to be left in peace." He paused, looking down at the paper in his hands. It contained a list of names. 42,000 names, sent to him that morning by the survivors of New Haven. The Dracorians have made their choice. Now we will make ours. Every human ship capable of reaching Dracorian space has been mobilized. Every reserve unit has been activated. Every weapon in our arsenal is being prepared. This is not about revenge. This is about justice. This is about sending a message that will echo through history for the next 3,000 years. In the crowd below, reporters shouted questions. Diplomats sent urgent messages to their governments. Citizens watched in silence, their faces reflecting the weight of what was happening. Somewhere in that crowd stood Nicole Marshall, the president's daughter. She was 28 years old, a lieutenant serving aboard the Endeavor. She had called her father that morning, not as a soldier to her commander, but as a child to her parent. "Come home safe," he had told her. "Why will?" she had replied. "We all will." Both of them knew it might be a lie. Across the galaxy, the Dracorian Empire prepared for war. Fleet Commander Vorax, the architect of the New Haven massacre, stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the reports coming in from his intelligence network. Human ships were gathering at the border. Human colonies were being evacuated. Human military bases were going to high alert. Vorax was not worried. He had studied humans for decades, had read their history and analyzed their tactics, and learned everything he could about their weaknesses. He knew they were emotional, impulsive, prone to making decisions based on feelings rather than logic. He knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. He knew that mathematics were on his side. "Let them come," he told his officers, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "The humans think they can challenge the might of the Dracorian Empire with a handful of ships and righteous anger. They will learn the same lesson every other species has learned. The strong survive. The weak perish. There is no room in this galaxy for sentiment." His officers clicked their agreement. The Dracorian fleet was the largest in the quadrant, built over centuries of conquest and expansion. They had never lost a war. They had never even come close. What Vorax did not know, what none of the Dracorians understood, was that humans did not fight the way other species fought. They did not line up their ships and trade fire until one side was destroyed. They did not follow the rules of war that had governed galactic conflict for millennia. Humans were creative. Humans were stubborn. Humans were willing to do things that other species considered impossible. Insane, or both. Back on Station Zenith, Ambassador Voss met privately with High Chancellor Morvax. They stood alone in a small room overlooking the stars. Two old diplomats who had spent their lives preventing exactly this kind of catastrophe. Kira Morvax said quietly, "I am begging you. Give us time to negotiate. Let us try to find a peaceful solution." Kira shook her head. "You had time, Chancellor. You had 3 days to stop the attack. You chose not to use them. I made a mistake. I know that now. But surely you can see that war will only lead to more death, more suffering. Your people will die. Millions of them." Yes, Kira agreed. "They will. And it will break my heart. But those colonists on New Haven trusted us to protect them. They trusted the galaxy to be fair. They died carving their names into stone because they wanted to be remembered. If we do not answer for them, if we let their deaths go unavenged, then we are telling every human in the galaxy that their lives do not matter, that they can be killed without consequence. She turned to face Morvax directly, her silver hair catching the starlight. We cannot live in a galaxy where that is true. We would rather die fighting than accept that kind of existence. That is what makes us human, Chancellor. That is why the warning exists. Not because we are powerful, because we are stubborn enough to destroy ourselves rather than surrender our principles. Morvax was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, his 4 shoulders sagging with defeat. I understand. I do not agree with you, but I understand. Kira placed a hand on his arm. Then, stay out of our way. When this is over, we will need friends to help us rebuild. I hope you will be one of them. She walked out of the room without looking back. Behind her, Morvax watched the stars and wondered if the galaxy would survive what was coming. The Dracorian Empire controlled 47 star systems, each one a jewel in the crown of their civilization. Their territory stretched across a quarter of the known galaxy, protected by a fleet of 2,000 warships and defended by warriors who had never known defeat. Their homeworld Drakkar Prime was a fortress wrapped in orbital defense platforms and planetary shields that could withstand the heat of a supernova. They had spent centuries building their empire, crushing anyone who dared to challenge them. They believed themselves invincible. Admiral Daniel Parker's fleet numbered 23 vessels. They emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Dracorian territory, their running lights burning bright against the darkness of space. To any observer, it looked like a suicide mission. 23 ships against 2,000. It was not even a contest. Fleet Commander Vorax received the sensor data on his bridge and felt his mandibles click with genuine amusement. He had prepared for this moment, had dreamed of it, had positioned his forces perfectly to crush the human response. Now here they were, these arrogant creatures, sailing into his trap like fish swimming toward a net. He broadcast a message to his crews, his voice dripping with contempt. The humans send children to fight. 23 ships against the might of the Dracorian Empire. Let us teach them the cost of arrogance. Let us show them what happens when prey forgets its place. His officers roared their approval. Across the fleet, warriors prepared for battle, eager to add another victory to their long list of conquests. The human fleet did not engage immediately. Instead, they stopped at the edge of weapons range and simply waited. Their ships hung motionless in space, silent and still, as if they were listening for something. Vorax frowned. This was not how enemies behaved. Enemies attacked or retreated. They did not simply stop and wait. What were the humans doing? On the Endeavor, Admiral Parker stood at the center of his bridge, surrounded by officers who had trained their entire lives for this moment. Katie Sullivan was at his side, her fingers dancing across a holographic display. Lieutenant Nicole Marshall monitored the weapons systems with grim efficiency. Every member of the crew knew what was about to happen. Every one of them had volunteered for this mission. Commander Sullivan, Daniel said quietly. Status report. Katie looked up from her display. All stations report ready, Admiral. Project Genesis is online and awaiting activation. Daniel nodded. He thought about New Haven. He thought about 42,000 names carved into a stone wall. He thought about a 7-year-old boy who had not spoken in 3 days. He thought about every human who had ever died because the galaxy believed humanity was weak. Activate it. Across human space, 117 deep space stations powered up simultaneously. They were scattered across 1,000 light years, hidden in asteroid belts and orbiting dead stars, and drifting in the empty spaces between systems. They were not weapons platforms. They did not carry missiles or energy cannons or fighter craft. They carried something far more terrifying. Humanity had spent 2 centuries studying the fundamental forces of the universe. They had learned to fold space, to compress time, to whisper to the fabric of reality itself. They had discovered secrets that other species believed were impossible, had developed technologies that violated every known law of physics. Project Genesis was the culmination of that research. It was a network capable of manipulating the gravitational constant within a targeted region of space. In simple terms, it could make gravity do whatever humanity wanted. The Dracorian fleet felt it first. Their ships began to drift, pulled off course by forces that should not have existed. Navigation systems screamed warnings as the laws of physics stopped making sense. Engines that had never failed suddenly sputtered and died. Hulls that had withstood centuries of combat began to buckle under their own weight. "What is happening?" Vorax demanded, his voice rising with panic. "Report, what is happening to my ships?" His officers had no answers. They watched in horror as their fleet began to collapse, as ships crushed themselves like empty cans, as gravity wells erupted across their formation like bubbles in boiling water. Stars dimmed around them as light itself bent toward the impossible forces that humanity had unleashed. "This is impossible," Vorax whispered. "This cannot be happening. This is impossible." On the Endeavor, Nicole Marshall watched the tactical display with tears in her eyes. She was not crying for the Dracorians. She was crying for New Haven. She was crying for the children who had carved their names into stone. She was crying because humanity had been forced to become monsters in order to survive. "Impossible is what we do," she whispered to herself. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. The human fleet did not fire a single shot. They simply watched as 2,000 Dracorian warships tore themselves apart under gravitational forces that their engineers could not comprehend, let alone counter. Some ships tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The gravity wells followed. Them hunted them, consumed them. When it was over, only wreckage remained. Debris floated in clouds of twisted metal and frozen air. Escape pods tumbled through space, carrying survivors who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what had happened. Vorax survived. His flagship had been at the rear of the formation, far enough from the worst effects to maintain hull integrity. He sat in his command chair, staring at the ruins of his fleet. Unable to comprehend what he was seeing, the human admiral's face appeared on his screen. "Fleet Commander Vorax," Daniel Parker said, his voice calm and quiet. "Your fleet has been neutralized. Your weapons platforms have been disabled. Your planetary shields are failing. You have two choices. Surrender unconditionally and face justice for what you did at New Haven, or watch us do to Drakkar Prime what we did to your ships." Vorax's mandibles trembled. "How? How did you do this? What weapon could possibly—" "It does not matter how," Daniel interrupted. "What matters is that you understand one simple truth. You were warned. Every species in this galaxy was warned. Never provoke humanity. You thought it was a legend? You thought we had grown soft? You thought you could kill our children and face no consequences?" He leaned forward, his eyes burning with cold fury. "You were wrong." The Dracorian surrender came 3 hours later. Vorax was arrested and transported to a human vessel for processing. His surviving officers were taken into custody. The empire that had stood for 10,000 years collapsed in a single day, brought down not by a superior force, but by a species that refused to accept the rules of war. As the human fleet moved toward Drakkar Prime to begin the occupation, Admiral Parker retreated to his quarters. He sat alone in the darkness, thinking about what he had done. He had destroyed 2,000 ships. He had killed hundreds of thousands of sentient beings. He had unleashed a weapon that would change galactic warfare forever. Katie found him there an hour later. "Admiral," she said softly, "the Confederacy is requesting a meeting. They want to discuss the implications of Project Genesis." Daniel did not look up. "Let them wait." "Sir, with respect, the entire galaxy is watching. They need to know that we are not going to use this weapon against everyone." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars. "Do you know why I joined the fleet, Katie?" She shook her head. "God, because I believed that humanity could be better. I believed we could explore the galaxy without conquering it. I believed we could be the species that proved war was unnecessary." He pressed his hand against the cold glass. "I still believe that. But the Dracorians did not give us a choice. They forced us to become what we never wanted to be." Katie stood beside him. "We did what we had to do, sir. Those colonists at New Haven deserve justice," as Daniel agreed. "They did. But I wonder if they would be proud of how we got it." He turned away from the viewport and straightened his uniform. Contact the Confederacy. Tell them I will address the council tomorrow. And Katie, make sure the survivors from New Haven are there. They should hear what I have to say." Katie nodded and left the room. Behind her, Admiral Parker stood alone with his thoughts, wondering if humanity had just saved itself or damned itself forever. The war lasted 11 days. It was the shortest major conflict in galactic history, and the most decisive. The Dracorian Empire, which had stood for 10,000 years and conquered dozens of species, ceased to exist as a military power in less than 2 weeks. Their fleet was gone. Their weapons platforms were silent. Their conquered systems declared independence one by one, liberated by a species they had never met but had heard stories about for centuries. The humans, the galaxy whispered. The humans did this. Fleet Commander Vorax was captured alive and transported to a neutral station for trial. The proceedings were broadcast across every inhabited world, watched by trillions of beings who wanted to understand how the massacre at New Haven had happened. Vorax showed no remorse. He argued that he had done nothing wrong, that the colonists were enemies of the Dracorian state, that his actions were justified under the laws of war. The tribunal disagreed. Vorax was sentenced to spend the remainder of his natural life on a prison colony orbiting a dying star. He would watch the light fade year by year, knowing that his empire had crumbled and his legacy was ash. Some called the sentence merciful. Others called it worse than death. Admiral Daniel Parker refused to attend the victory celebrations. He did not appear at the parades or the ceremonies or the speeches that followed the war. Instead, he returned to New Haven with a small crew and a cargo hold full of memorial stones. Katie Sullivan found him there, kneeling in the same spot where Lieutenant Commander Sam Griffin had knelt weeks before. The fields were still ash. The buildings were still rubble. But the stone wall remained, covered with 42,000 names carved by desperate hands. "The Confederacy is requesting a meeting," Katie said softly, approaching her admiral with careful steps. "They want to discuss new protocols for preventing future conflicts. They want to talk about Project Genesis and what it means for galactic security." Daniel did not look up. He was placing a memorial stone at the base of the wall, adding it to the hundreds of others he had already set in place. Each stone bore a name from the wall above it. Each name was a life that had been stolen. Let them wait. Katie stood beside him in silence. She watched as he worked, as he read each name aloud before placing the corresponding stone. It was a ritual, she realized, a way of honoring the dead by acknowledging that they had existed, that they had mattered, that they would not be forgotten. "Sir," she said eventually, "the galaxy needs to hear from you. They need to know what we stand for. They need to know that Project Genesis will not be used against them." Daniel placed the final stone and stood up slowly. His uniform was covered in dust. His hands were dirty. His eyes were tired. "I know," he said. "I know what they need. I just needed to do this first." He looked at the wall one last time, reading the names of the dead. Then he turned and walked back toward the shuttle, his footsteps heavy on the scorched earth. 3 days later, Admiral Parker stood in the center of the Confederacy Council chamber. The room was packed with delegates from every known species, all of them watching the human with a mixture of fear and fascination. This was the man who had destroyed 2,000 warships without firing a shot. This was the architect of the most devastating military victory in galactic history. In the front row sat the 3 survivors from New Haven: George Palmer, the old teacher, his hands still trembling; Lisa Turner, the young botanist, her face pale but determined; and a 7-year-old boy whose name was Kevin Wright, who had finally started speaking again 2 days ago. His first words had been a question. Why did they hurt us? No one had been able to answer him. Daniel looked at the survivors, at the boy who had lost everything, and felt his heart break all over again. Then he turned to face the assembly. "You had a warning," he said, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. It was simple. It was clear. Never provoke humanity. Some of you thought it was a legend, a story told to frighten children. Some of you thought we had changed, that the long peace had made us weak. We have not changed. He took a step forward, his eyes moving across the room. We are explorers. We are scientists. We are artists and dreamers and builders. We want nothing more than to reach the next star, to discover the next wonder, to share what we find with anyone willing to learn. We spent 3,000 years proving that we could be trusted. We asked only to be left in peace. His voice hardened. But we are also the species that crawled out of the mud and looked at the universe and said, "This is ours to explore." We are the species that turned death into medicine, that turned the atom into power, that turned the void into a highway. We are the species that will burn empires to the ground to protect our children. He looked at High Chancellor Morvax. The Dracorian Empire no longer exists as a military power. Their conquered systems have been liberated. Their war criminals have been punished. This matter is closed. Morvax nodded slowly, his forearms folded across his chest. He had learned his lesson. The entire galaxy had learned its lesson. Ambassador Kira Voss stepped forward, her silver hair catching the light of distant stars. She stood beside Daniel, representing humanity not as soldiers, but as diplomats. The sword and the olive branch side by side. "Let this serve as a reminder to anyone who might forget," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The warning still stands. It has always stood. We are humanity. We do not start wars, but we finish them." The council remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what had happened, of what could happen again, pressed down on every being in the room. Outside the chamber, news of the speech spread across the galaxy. Species that had never heard of humanity before learned about them now. Young officers received updated briefings. Old admirals revised their strategic assessments. The ancient proverb was passed down once more, but this time it carried new weight. Never provoke the humans. They remember everything, and they never forgive. 6 months later, New Haven was reborn. The ash fields had been cleared and replanted with Dr. Nathan Cole's engineered wheat. New buildings rose from the rubble, stronger than before. Families moved in from across human space. Drawn by the promise of a fresh start and the determination to honor those who had died, at the heart of the rebuilt colony stood a monument. It was made of the same local stone as the original wall, carved with the same 42,000 names. But now there was an inscription beneath them. Words that would be read by every visitor, every pilgrim, every child who came to learn about what had happened here. We remember. We always remember. Lieutenant Nicole Marshall visited the monument on the first anniversary of the massacre. She stood before the names in her dress uniform, her father's words echoing in her memory. "Come home safe," he had told her. She had kept that promise. Thousands of others had not. Admiral Parker joined her there, standing in silence among the wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. The young sun shone down on them, warm and bright, as if the universe itself was trying to apologize for what it had allowed to happen. "Do you think they would be proud of us?" Nicole asked, looking at the names on the wall. Daniel considered the question for a long moment. He thought about the war, about the lives he had taken, about the weapon he had unleashed. He thought about the Dracorians who had died in their ships, crushed by forces they could not understand. He thought about the price humanity had paid to secure justice. "I think they would be grateful," he said finally. "Grateful that we remembered them. Grateful that we fought for them. Grateful that we made sure no one else would suffer the same fate." Nicole nodded slowly. "Is that enough?" Daniel looked at the monument, at the names of the dead, at the wheat fields that had once been ash. "It has to be," he said. "It is all we have." They stood together in silence as the sun set over New Haven, casting long shadows across the rebuilt colony. Somewhere in the galaxy, the warning was being passed from species to species, from generation to generation. A reminder of what happened when humanity was pushed too far. Never provoked the humans. Someone had. And now the galaxy would never forget what came next.